Hey, Cypher here. Before we get started, this is part 6 of a series I've been doing on California history. If you haven't seen the previous ones, that's not necessary to see this one, but context is always useful. This can be viewed in isolation if you prefer though. So, on with the show. When the election of 1860 began, California was a prominent part of it. People were distinctly Republican-leaning in the West, when the rest of the nation was more divided than ever before or since. Ultimately, Lincoln won with a plurality of 40%. In other states, it was mostly because Republicans were unified while Democrats had split. But in the West, he won because Republicanism was primarily about stopping slavery from spreading westward, something that a lot of Californians could get behind. But that wasn't true for everyone. There were significant divides in California's electorate. No county in California voted a majority for Lincoln. When the South seceded as a result, people were indecisive about their position on the matter. The Confederacy formed, and the secession crisis loomed in 1861. There was a new outburst of violence throughout California, almost as though the bloody 50s had gotten a new lease into the 1860s. Dueling, murders, and vigilantism had their last gasp. For instance, in my hometown of San Luis Obispo, there was a man shot and killed during the 4th of July by a presiding judge while he raised the Star-Spangled Banner. California was divided along north and south. Southern California had attempted to form their own state several times throughout the 1850s, with the state even electing to separate herself in 1859, called the Pico Act because it was supported by Pico, the former Mexican governor of Alta California. The federal elections stopped that. General Johnston was in control of the military in California, and he almost conspired to promote SoCal in seceding from the Union under the Pico Act. That failed, but Johnston did become the first leading general of the Confederate Army, before Robert E. Lee. Militias started forming in California, mostly pro-Union, but a few pro-Confederate ones in the South and far north. When the Arizona Territory voted to secede, it was realized that the war would touch all the way west. When the Confederacy attacked Fort Sumter, secessionists in California began demonstrating. One guy even tried to march with the Confederate flag in Sacramento on the 4th of July. The U.S. cavalry was brought in to stop them, so many secessionists left to join the Confederacy elsewhere. Others, like Thomas Starr King, worked tirelessly to convince California to stay in the Union. King himself died young as a result of this lecture circuit. But because he was so good at convincing people, he's sometimes called the orator that saved the nation. For the most part, California didn't really participate in the war overall. There were minor incidents, and a lot of volunteers who fought on both sides, mostly on the Union side though. But in California, there was mostly just some gang activity. It was in support of the Union that California made the most difference. A lot of gold was sent to the Union, and California formed a safe zone for the Trans-Mississippi Theater. Despite conscription not being applicable to Californians, there were tens of thousands of volunteers. Even though it had been funded before secession began, a telegraph line began to be built between California and the Union as part of the war effort. It replaced the short-lived Pony Express, a service that had shortened the time for mail delivery by rapidly switching horses in 1860. The 2,000-mile-long telegraph was built in just 5 months, and it truly linked the isolated state with the rest of the Union. And that was just the beginning, because the first Transcontinental Railroad began a couple of years later, though it wouldn't be completed until 4 years after the war. These were important projects, not only for California, but the Union as a whole as it tried to consolidate power during the war. California faced a major economic turnaround during the war, but in no way caused by it. In 1862, the worst flood ever to hit the state came through. It is sometimes called an arc storm, and it managed to flood the Central Valley so badly it turned into a veritable lake. A year later, the worst drought hit, hardly raining at all. This devastated the cattle industry in California, which was still going strong until then. Some towns spoke of the hills glistening with the bleaching bones of cattle, starved due to the lack of grass. but California rebuilt. The Republican Party used the chaos of the disasters and war to solidify political power in California. For a political party that had just sprung up into existence only a few years prior, it was suddenly in charge of a good chunk of California's legislature, and even the governor was Republican. The federal government created the Union League, which was a fraternal organization that used their secret membership to coordinate political maneuvers on behalf of the Unionist cause. This resulted in California becoming thoroughly Republican by the time the war was over in 1865. Despite being one of the most anti-slavery states in the Union, having it written into the state's constitution and beginning the entire debate over popular sovereignty as a result, California was not immune to the Reconstruction that followed the Civil War. Despite being officially a free state, California had a law on the books that is often compared to slavery, but since it only affected American Indians, it is not as well known. But it was well known at the time throughout the United States and became the basis of a huge controversy that changed national history. Beginning in California's first year as a state, with the 1850 Act for the Government and Protection of Indians, Indians saw some of the worst disenfranchisement laws in American history. They could be forced off of land simply by request of a settler, so long as a justice of the peace issued a warrant, which were readily given out for a decade. Any Indian labeled a vagrant for whatever reason by a public official of all levels could be sentenced to a punishment that official deemed fit without trial. And Indian children could be forcibly apprenticed until they were considered fully mature if their parents were ruled negligent in any shape or form. The act was amended in various ways over time, often to make it even more malicious. As late as 1862, it was reported that some hard stories are told of those engaged in the trade, in regard to the manner of the capture of children. It is even asserted that there are men engaged in it who do not hesitate, when they find a rancheria well stocked with young Indians, to murder in cold blood all the old ones, in order that they may safely possess themselves of all the offspring. Some of the act was pushed back by Republicans, especially the forced apprenticeships, but much of the legislation remained in place after the Civil War ended. The former Confederacy used these laws as a model to establish the infamous Black Codes. These Black Codes set off radical Reconstruction, where martial law was declared in numerous states to stop these codes and administer federal civil rights legislation. What often gets forgotten about this is that it also happened in California. The Peonage Abolition Act of 1867 was a piece of radical Reconstruction originally aimed at New Mexico, but it effectively ended a good chunk of what was left in California's Indian Code. Unfortunately, there was one remnant that has a lasting effect to this day. There was another component of the code that actually did more to end the abuse of the system than Reconstruction. California endorsed violent policies that ultimately left the native population devastated, right as a new form of labor took its place. But all of that will have to wait for the next episode, so if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to see that when I get to it. And I'll see you next time.